The journey from San Francisco to the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains had been arduous. Thomas Mercer wiped the sweat from his brow as his wagon finally crested the hill overlooking what would be his new home. A sprawling property abandoned by its previous owners, the Ríos family. The late October sun cast long shadows across the overgrown fields, illuminating the weathered two-story farmhouse that stood solitary against the backdrop of pine forests. "We've made it, Eleanor," he called to his wife, who sat beside him, their 3 children huddled together in the wagon bed behind them. Eleanor's face remained expressionless as she surveyed their new beginning. "It doesn't look like much, Thomas. The land agent assured me it's the finest property in the county. 20 acres of fertile soil, a working well, and the house is solid California redwood, all for a price we could never dream of back east." What Thomas didn't mention was the unease he'd felt when signing the papers. The land agent's nervous demeanor, the way local townspeople fell silent when he'd mentioned purchasing the old Ríos place. The price had been too good, suspiciously so. As they approached the homestead, the children, William, aged 12, Margaret, 10, and little Samuel, only 6, remained unusually quiet. The house loomed larger as they drew near, its windows like vacant eyes watching their approach. "Papa, someone's there," Margaret suddenly cried, pointing toward an upstairs window. Thomas squinted against the setting sun. "Nonsense, child. The place has been empty for months." But Eleanor had seen it too, a shadow moving quickly away from the glass. "Thomas ... double quotes," she began, her voice tinged with apprehension. "It's just the light playing tricks," he insisted, though his hands tightened on the reins. "Come now, we should unload before dark." The front door creaked loudly as Thomas pushed it open. The interior smelled of dust and something else, something sour that made Eleanor cover her nose with her handkerchief. Furniture remained in place as if the previous occupants had left in a hurry, a dining table with chairs askew. Shelves of books, kitchen implements hanging from hooks. "How strange they left so much behind," Eleanor whispered. Thomas forced a cheerful tone. "Fortune for us. Saves us the trouble of bringing it all the way from San Francisco that night." As the family settled into their new home, strange sounds echoed through the walls, scratching like something trying to get in or out. Thomas dismissed it as mice or the house settling. But at dawn, they discovered the kitchen floor covered in tiny footprints, too small for any of them to have made, pressed into a fine layer of dust, leading from the cellar door to the back entrance, then vanishing. "Raccoons most likely," Thomas declared, though raccoons didn't typically walk upright as these prints suggested. Eleanor said nothing, but her eyes met his with silent understanding. Something wasn't right about this place. Something the townspeople knew but wouldn't say. The first week passed in a flurry of activity as the Mercers settled into their new home. Thomas spent his days clearing overgrown fields while Eleanor scrubbed years of grime from the house. The children explored the property's boundaries, though Thomas had strictly forbidden them from entering the dense woods that bordered the eastern edge of their land. It was William who first discovered the graves. "Papa, Papa, come quick!" His panicked voice carried across the field where Thomas was working. The boy stood at the edge of a small orchard, his face pale with shock. Thomas dropped his tools and ran. "What is it, son?" William pointed to a clearing beyond the apple trees. "There, under those stones, 3 small mounds of earth, each topped with crude stone markers, lay in a neat row. No names were carved into the stones, but someone had etched a single symbol into each, a circle with a cross beneath it. "Children's graves," Thomas whispered, his blood running cold. He'd seen enough burial sites to recognize the dimensions. That evening, Thomas rode into town, determined to get answers. At the local tavern, he found men willing to talk after a few drinks loosened their tongues. The Ríos family? An old miner named Jackson spat into a brass spittoon. Mexican folks. Kept to themselves, mostly. Salvador Ríos was a hard worker. Brought his wife Maria and their 5 children here from somewhere down south. 5 children? Thomas asked, remembering the 3 small graves. The barkeeper, a heavy-set man named Daniels, leaned in. "They lost 3 within a week. Fever," they said, but rumors spread. "Some townsfolk claimed they heard strange chanting from the property at night," said the Ríos woman. "Practiced old ways, if you understand my meaning." Jackson nodded grimly. When the remaining children started talking about seeing their dead siblings walking at night, well, folks got suspicious. "What happened to them?" Thomas pressed. The men exchanged glances. "They just up and disappeared one night," Daniels finally said. "Left everything behind. Some say they fled back to Mexico. Others say double quote," she trailed off, eyeing Thomas carefully. "Say what?" "That they never left at all," Jackson finished, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas returned home troubled. He found Eleanor sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at something on the table. "The children found this inside the wall while I was cleaning today," she said without looking up. It was a small cloth doll, handmade with black button eyes and a stitched frown. A piece of paper had been sewn into its chest, visible through a tear in the fabric. Thomas carefully extracted it and unfolded the brittle page. Written in a child's unsteady hand were the words, "They are in the walls. They watch us sleep." The scratching started again that night, more insistent than before. Thomas lay awake beside Eleanor, listening to the sound travel through the walls, up across the ceiling, down again, following a path no animal should be able to navigate. "Thomas," Eleanor whispered, her hand finding his in the darkness. "There's someone in the house." "Nonsense," he replied, though without conviction. "The wind, that's all." But they both knew it wasn't the wind. Just as they knew the footsteps they sometimes heard pacing the hallway when all the family was accounted for weren't simply the house settling. William had taken to sleeping with a knife under his pillow. Margaret refused to be alone, even during daylight hours. And little Samuel had started talking to someone neither Thomas nor Eleanor could see, a friend. He called them, who lived in the walls and told him secrets. "What kind of secrets, Samuel?" Eleanor had asked one morning, trying to keep her voice light. "About the children who lived here before," Samuel replied innocently. "About how they couldn't leave." Thomas had forbidden further discussion of such nonsense. But that afternoon, while clearing debris from the overgrown garden, he made a disturbing discovery: a trapdoor, concealed beneath vines and soil, its metal ring handle rusted but intact. It took considerable strength to pull it open. The hinges groaned in protest as Thomas peered into the darkness below. A dank smell rose from the opening, earth and mold and something else, something that made him recoil instinctively. A ladder descended into what appeared to be a root cellar. Thomas returned to the house for a lantern before lowering himself down. The space was larger than he expected, extending beneath the foundation of the house itself. His lantern cast dancing shadows across walls lined with empty shelves and hooks that might once have held preserved foods. But it was the far corner that drew his attention, and his horror. A small makeshift altar stood against the wall. Candle stubs, their wax dripped and hardened in long rivulets. Strange symbols drawn in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. And photographed daguerreotypes of 3 children, their faces scratched out with some sharp implement. Thomas backed away, nearly dropping his lantern. His heel struck something that shifted beneath the dirt floor. Kneeling, he brushed away the soil to reveal a wooden box. Inside were folded papers, letters written in Spanish that he couldn't read, though he recognized Salvador Ríos' signature. Among them was a newspaper clipping in English. Dated 6 months prior. Local man claims family terrorized by unknown entity. The article described Salvador's desperate pleas for help, insisting something had followed them from their homeland, something that had already taken 3 of his children, and now threatened the remaining 2. The town had dismissed his claims as the ravings of a superstitious mind. Thomas carefully returned everything to the box, replaced it in the earth, and climbed out of the cellar. He would tell Eleanor nothing of what he had found. They had invested everything in this property. They couldn't afford to leave. But as he walked back to the house, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from every window. "They're taking Samuel's things," Eleanor said one morning, her face drawn with exhaustion. Dark circles ringed her eyes from weeks of disturbed sleep. Thomas looked up from his coffee. "What are you talking about?" "His toys. His clothes. They disappear and then reappear in strange places. Yesterday I found his wooden horse inside the wall. There's a gap in the plaster in his room. Samuel says that's where they live." Thomas slammed his cup down, coffee sloshing onto the table. "Enough of this nonsense, Eleanor. The boy's playing tricks, nothing more." But even as he said it, Thomas knew it wasn't true. He'd seen things himself these past weeks that defied explanation. The dining room chairs rearranged in the night. Muddy footprints too small to belong to any of them. And once a glimpse of something small and quick darting around a corner, something that looked like a child but moved all wrong, its limbs jerking unnaturally. Oh, Margaret had taken ill 3 days prior. A fever that came suddenly and burned hot, resisting Eleanor's every attempt to break it. The girl lay listless in her bed, occasionally murmuring words that made no sense. "They want us to play with them," she'd whispered that morning when Thomas checked on her. "They're so lonely in the walls." William had become Thomas's shadow, refusing to be left alone. "They watch me while I sleep, Papa," he confessed. "I feel their hands touching my face." That afternoon, while Eleanor tended to Margaret, Thomas took William with him to town. They needed supplies, but more importantly, Thomas needed information. He located the town's oldest resident, or weathered, Mexican man named Ortiz, who had once worked alongside Salvador Ríos. "I warned Salvador," Ortiz said, shaking his head sadly when Thomas inquired about the previous owners. Some things should not be disturbed, but he found it while digging the foundation for his home. Found what? Thomas pressed. Ortiz leaned forward. An old burial ground, not Christian, much older. The native people here considered that land cursed. Salvador should have stopped building when he found the bones, but he needed the home for his family, and you believe ... what, that some curse took his children. The old man's eyes held Thomas's gaze steadily. I believe, Senor, that grief can take many forms. Salvador's children died of fever, one after another. His wife Maria was from Oaxaca, where they believe the dead can be called back if your need is great enough. You're saying she tried to bring them back? William asked, his young face pale. Ortiz nodded solemnly. The old ways are powerful but dangerous. What returns is rarely what was lost. On the ride home, William stayed unusually quiet until they were approaching the property. Papa, he finally said, I think Margaret has the same fever that killed the Ríos children. A cold knot formed in Thomas's stomach. Your sister will be fine. Samuel says they want her to stay with them forever. Thomas whipped the horses faster. They found Eleanor in Margaret's room, pressing cool cloths to the girl's forehead. Margaret's skin burned with impossible heat, her nightdress soaked with sweat. Her fever's worse, Eleanor said, not looking up as Thomas entered. She keeps talking about children in the walls, calling to her. Thomas approached the bed, laying a hand on his daughter's brow. She was burning up. We need to get the doctor from town. No time. Eleanor shook her head. Look at her, Thomas. She's slipping away from us. Margaret's eyes suddenly flew open, but they seemed to focus on something beyond her father. They're here, she whispered. Thomas turned, following her gaze to the corner of the room. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw them, 3 small figures with dark eyes and grinning mouths. Then they were gone, if they'd ever been there at all. Samuel knows where the medicine is, Margaret continued, her voice eerily calm. They showed him. Thomas found his youngest son in the hallway, staring at the wall. Samuel? The boy turned, his expression blank. In the cellar, behind the altar. The Ríos lady made it for her children, but it didn't work right. What didn't work right, Samuel? The medicine. I was supposed to keep them here, but it kept them in the walls instead. A chill ran down Thomas's spine. Show me. Samuel led him to the hidden trapdoor Thomas had discovered weeks earlier. Down in the root cellar, the boy walked confidently to the altar in the corner and reached behind it, pulling out a small glass bottle filled with dark liquid. This will make Margaret better? Thomas asked, taking the bottle carefully. Samuel's eyes met his, suddenly clear and frightened. No, Papa. It will make her like them. Thomas nearly dropped the bottle. What do you mean? The Ríos children never left, Samuel whispered. They're trapped here. They want friends to play with forever. Thomas grabbed his son's shoulders. Samuel, tell me what's happening in this house. The boy's lip trembled. They want us to join them. They're so lonely, Papa. Thomas corked the bottle securely and pocketed it. Whatever this concoction was, he would not be giving it to his daughter. He lifted Samuel and quickly climbed out of the cellar. As they emerged into the fading daylight, Thomas froze. Standing by the garden gate was a woman in a long black dress, her hair covered with a dark shawl. For an instant he thought it was Eleanor, but as the figure turned toward him, he realized it was someone else entirely, someone with hollow eyes and a face twisted by grief. When he blinked, she was gone. That night, Margaret's fever peaked. She thrashed in her bed, calling out names none of them recognized. Eleanor prayed by her bedside while Thomas kept vigil by the window, watching the property for any sign of the woman he'd seen. William had taken Samuel to the furthest bedroom, barricading the door with a heavy dresser. The scratching in the walls had grown louder, more frantic, as if whatever made the sound knew something the Mercers did not. Just past midnight, Margaret suddenly sat upright in bed, her eyes wide open. They're coming for me, she said clearly. Then she collapsed back, her breathing shallow and rapid. Eleanor turned to Thomas, her face streaked with tears. We need to leave this place. Now. We can't move her in this condition, Thomas argued. We can't keep her here either, Eleanor hissed. Don't you understand what's happening? This house is... A sudden crash from below cut her off. Thomas grabbed the rifle he'd kept loaded since their arrival and moved toward the stairs. Stay with her, he ordered Eleanor. The main floor was dark except for moonlight streaming through windows. Thomas moved cautiously, rifle ready. The crash had come from the kitchen. Found the back door wide open, swinging in the night breeze. On the floor lay scattered dishes, as if swept from the table by an unseen hand. And there, standing in the doorway, was the woman in black. Maria Ríos, Thomas said, realizing who she must be. The woman didn't respond, only stared at him with those hollow eyes. What do you want? He demanded, raising the rifle. Why are you tormenting my family? When she spoke, her voice was like dry leaves rustling. You live in my house. You sleep where my children died. And now your children will join mine. Get out, Thomas growled, leveling the rifle at her chest. Maria Rios smiled, a terrible expression on her grief-ravaged face. We never left, Sonora screamed from upstairs. Eleanor sent Thomas running, forgetting the intruder entirely. Thomas took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding in his chest. The screaming had stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. Eleanor, he called, bursting into Margaret's room. It was empty. The bed where his daughter had lain fighting fever was vacant, the sheets thrown back. Eleanor was nowhere to be seen. Eleanor? Margaret. Panic rose in Thomas's throat as he checked the adjoining rooms. Nothing. He ran to the room where William had taken Samuel, finding the dresser still barricaded against the door. It took all his strength to push it aside enough to enter. William lay on the floor, unconscious but breathing. Samuel sat cross-legged on the bed, staring at the wall, his lips moving in silent conversation. Samuel, Thomas said sharply, kneeling to check on William. Where's your mother? Where's Margaret? Samuel turned to him with vacant eyes. They took them into the walls. What are you talking about? Thomas shook his son gently. Samuel, this is important. The lady said they needed a mother. Their mother went away, so they needed ours. Thomas felt ice in his veins. The lady, Maria Rios. She was here? In this room? Samuel nodded. She comes through the walls. She said Margaret belongs with them now. She said we'll all be together soon. William groaned, beginning to stir. A bruise was forming on his temple. William, what happened? Thomas asked as his eldest son's eyes fluttered open. Someone hit me, William mumbled. I was watching Samuel, and then ... I heard something in the wall. When I went to look, something struck me. Thomas helped William to his feet. We're getting out of here. Now. We'll go to town and bring back help to find Eleanor and Margaret. They won't come back with you, Samuel said matter-of-factly. They know about this house. They're afraid. Thomas grabbed a lamp and his rifle. Stay close to me, both of you, as they moved through the upstairs hallway. Thomas noticed something he'd overlooked before: tiny seams in the wallpaper, forming what appeared to be outlines of doorways that didn't exist. He pressed against one section, feeling it give slightly beneath his hand. Papa, don't, Samuel cried. That's how they get you. Thomas backed away, ushering his sons toward the stairs. But as they reached the top step, a low moan echoed through the house, Eleanor's voice filled with pain or fear. Eleanor, Thomas shouted. Where are you? Her voice came again, seeming to emanate from inside the walls themselves. Thomas ... help us ... double quotes. She's in the spaces, Samuel whispered. The house has spaces that aren't on the outside. Thomas stared at his youngest son. What do you mean? The Rios children showed me. There are rooms inside the walls. Hidden rooms where they live now. A cold certainty settled over Thomas. He'd heard stories of houses with secret passageways, hidden rooms, but this was something different. Something wrong. How do we get to these spaces, Samuel? The boy pointed to the wall at the end of the hall. Through there. But Papa, if you go in, you might not come back out. Thomas squared his shoulders. William, take your brother to the wagon. Hitch the horses and be ready to leave. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, ride to town and bring help. I'm coming with you, William protested. No. Thomas gripped his son's shoulders. I need you to protect Samuel. Can you do that for me? Reluctantly, William nodded. Thomas watched as his sons descended the stairs, then turned to face the wall Samuel had indicated. Upon closer inspection, he could see a thin seam running from floor to ceiling. He pressed against different sections until he felt one give way, swinging inward like a door. Beyond was darkness and the smell of damp earth. Taking a deep breath, Thomas ducked through the opening, holding his lamp high. The passage was impossibly narrow, forcing Thomas to turn sideways to navigate it. The walls felt wrong against his shoulders, not wood or plaster, but something soft and yielding, almost like flesh. The thought made him shudder. His lamp illuminated rough-hewn wooden beams above, supporting the house's structure, but the walls themselves seemed formed of some other material he couldn't identify. The passage twisted and turned in ways that defied the house's exterior dimensions, descending gradually deeper than the foundation should have allowed. Eleanor, he called, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. The sound reached him faint, like children's laughter, echoing from somewhere ahead. Thomas pressed forward, the passage widening into a small chamber. The space was lined with children's drawings covering every surface, crude figures holding hands. A house with faces peering from windows. A woman in black standing among graves. In the center of the room stood a child-sized table set for a tea party, complete with chipped cups and saucers. Thomas felt his skin crawl as he noticed the 3 chairs pulled up to the table weren't empty. Small bundles of cloth and sticks had been arranged to resemble children, button eyes sewn onto featureless faces. Beyond this macabre playroom, the passage continued, branching in multiple directions. Thomas hesitated, unsure which way to go. Thomas ... quotes Eleanor's voice, closer now, coming from the leftmost passage. He hurried forward, ducking under low-hanging beams. The next chamber was larger, its ceiling high enough for him to stand upright. Here the walls were lined with shelves holding dozens of small personal effects toys. Ribbons, fragments of clothing, locks of hair, mementos of the children who had lived and died in this house. In the center of the room stood Maria Ríos, her back to him. Beyond her, Eleanor knelt on the ground, cradling Margaret's limp form in her arms. Eleanor. Thomas rushed forward, but Maria turned, fixing him with those hollow eyes. "You should not have come here," she said softly. "This place is not for the living." Thomas raised his rifle. "Let my family go," Maria smiled sadly. "Your wife came willingly to save your daughter, but I cannot save what is already taken." Eleanor looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Thomas, Margaret's gone. She stopped breathing minutes ago." Thomas felt the floor drop from beneath him. No, that's not possible. "The fever took my children too," Maria said. "One by one. I tried to bring them back. I used the old ways, the forbidden rituals. But what came back, ... She gestured to the walls around them. "They are trapped between worlds now, neither living nor dead. And they are so lonely." A soft scratching sound filled the chamber as Maria spoke, the same noise that had haunted their nights since arriving. Thomas realized with horror that it was coming from inside the walls themselves. "They need companions," Maria continued. "They called to your children from the moment you arrived. Your youngest hears them clearly. Your daughter joined them willingly." "You're insane," Thomas growled, stepping toward Eleanor and Margaret. "I tried to warn the others," Maria said as if she hadn't heard him. "The families who came after we fled. None stayed more than a month. But you ignored the signs." "Thomas," Eleanor sobbed, "we have to get out of here. We have to take Margaret and go." As Thomas reached for his daughter's body, the scratching in the walls grew louder, more frantic. Tiny handprints began appearing on the surface, pressing outward as if something was trying to break through. "They will not let you leave with her," Maria warned. "She belongs to them now." The lamp flickered, shadows dancing across the chamber. Thomas thought he saw small figures darting at the edges of the light, children with hollow eyes and grinning mouths. "Run," Maria suddenly hissed. "Take your wife and your living sons and run. Never return to this place." "Not without Margaret," Thomas insisted, reaching down to lift his daughter's body. As his hands touched her, Margaret's eyes flew open, but they were not her eyes anymore. They were black, pupilless, and ancient. Thomas recoiled as Margaret sat up, her head tilting at an impossible angle. "She stays with us, Papa," she said in a voice that was not her own. "We're having a tea party. Would you like to join us?" Eleanor screamed, scrambling backward as Margaret rose to her feet with jerky, unnatural movements. Thomas grabbed his wife's arm, pulling her behind him as he leveled the rifle at the thing wearing their daughter's face. "That's not Margaret," he said hoarsely. Maria Ríos stepped between them. "What stands before you is neither your daughter nor my children, but something that has lived in this land long before any of us. It takes the form of what we love most because our grief gives it power." "What are you saying?" Thomas demanded. "I did not bring my children back with my rituals," Maria explained, her voice heavy with remorse. "I opened a door for this thing to enter our world. It took my children first, then claimed this house as its domain." Margaret, the thing possessing her, smiled with too many teeth. "We only want to play," it said in that horrible multi-voiced tone. "Won't you stay and play with us, Papa? Mama?" The walls around them bulged, small hands pressing outward from within. The house itself seemed to be breathing, contracting around them. "We need to get out now," Thomas urged Eleanor, backing toward the passage. "We'll come back with help." "There is no help for this," Maria said flatly. "I tried to burn the house after it took my children. It would not burn. I tried to warn others away. They would not listen." Eleanor clutched Thomas's arm. "Our sons are still outside," Thomas finished. "If we can reach them." A low rumble shook the chamber as the thing wearing Margaret's form took a step toward them. "No one leaves," it said. "You'll stay. You'll all stay." Maria suddenly moved, placing herself between the entity and the Mercers. "Go," she commanded them. "The passage behind the shelf leads to the cellar. You can escape that way." "What about you?" Thomas asked. "Should have died with my children," Maria replied. "Perhaps today I will." As she spoke, she withdrew a small glass bottle identical to the one Samuel had found, the medicine that hadn't worked right. She uncorked it and raised it toward the thing wearing Margaret's body. "I bound you once to this house," she said to the entity. I can bind you more tightly still." Thomas hesitated only a moment before pulling Eleanor toward the hidden exit Maria had indicated. Behind them he heard Margaret's voice, her real voice, breaking through for just an instant. "Papa, Mama, run!" They fled through the narrow passage, emerging into the root cellar Thomas had discovered weeks earlier. Eleanor collapsed against him, sobbing uncontrollably. "Margaret, our little girl, that wasn't her anymore," Thomas said firmly, though his own heart was shattering. "We have to get William and Samuel away from here." They climbed the ladder to the surface, the night air cool against their faces after the oppressive atmosphere below. Thomas helped Eleanor to her feet, and they ran toward the front of the house where the wagon should have been waiting. It was gone. "William!" Thomas shouted. "Samuel!" No answer came. The property lay silent under the moonlight, no sign of their sons or the wagon. "They must have gone for help," Eleanor reasoned, her voice shaking. Thomas wasn't so sure. "We need to get to town. We'll follow the road. They can't have gotten far." As they hurried down the long drive toward the main road, a noise behind them made Thomas turn. The house stood silhouetted against the night sky, and for a moment, he thought he saw faces at every window, children's faces, watching them leave. A sudden wind rose, carrying whispers that sounded like laughter. "Don't look back," Thomas told Eleanor, gripping her hand tightly. "Just keep walking." They reached town just before dawn, exhausted and wild-eyed. The sheriff found them collapsed on the steps of his office, Eleanor delirious with grief, Thomas demanding a search party. "My sons," he kept repeating. "We have to find my sons." Sheriff Davis was a practical man who had lived in the area all his life. He had known about the Ríos homestead and its dark reputation for years. When Thomas finished his fragmented tale, the sheriff didn't dismiss him as a madman, which Thomas had half expected. "That place has never set right with me," Davis admitted, pouring Thomas a strong cup of coffee. "We'll gather men and search for your boys, but double quotes," he hesitated. "But what?" Thomas pressed. "No one who's gone missing around that property has ever been found," the sheriff finished quietly. By mid-morning, a group of 20 men had assembled, armed with rifles and grim determination. The town doctor had given Eleanor a sedative, leaving her to rest at the hotel while the search commenced. They approached the Ríos homestead cautiously. In daylight, the house looked almost ordinary, weathered but solid, windows reflecting the sun. No faces peered out. No unnatural sounds emanated from within. "The wagon's not here," one of the men called out, examining the churned earth of the drive. "Looks like it headed east toward the mountains." Thomas felt a surge of hope. If William had taken Samuel away from the property, there was a chance they had escaped whatever horror claimed Margaret. Sheriff Davis organized the men into groups to search the surrounding area while he, Thomas, and 3 deputies approached the house. "We need to check inside," Thomas insisted. "The hidden passages, Mr. F. Mercer," the sheriff interrupted gently. "I believe your story, but I also know you've suffered a terrible shock. Let's search the house proper first." They found nothing unusual inside, no sign of Maria Ríos, no evidence of the nightmare Thomas and Eleanor had experienced. The walls were solid when the men knocked on them. The rooms contained only ordinary furniture covered in dust. "The root cellar," Thomas urged. "It's an entrance to the passages there." But when they located the trapdoor and descended, they found only an ordinary storage cellar. The altar Thomas had described was gone. The walls were solid earth and stone. "I don't understand," Thomas whispered, running his hands along the wall where the passage had been. "It was here. We came through here." Sheriff Davis placed a hand on his shoulder. "Grief can do strange things to a man's mind, Mr. Mercer. Perhaps I'm not imagining this." Thomas shrugged off the sheriff's hand. "My wife saw it too. Our daughter's still in there somewhere." One of the deputies called down from above. "Sheriff, they've found tracks from the wagon heading east. And something else, a boy's cap by the forest edge." Hope and dread warred in Thomas's chest as he climbed up to examine the discovery. It was William's cap, unmistakably, found at the edge of the woods Thomas had forbidden his children from entering. The search continued through the day and into the evening. Lanterns bobbed among the trees as men called the boys' names. Thomas pushed himself beyond exhaustion, refusing to rest until his sons were found. Just as darkness fell completely, a shout went up from deep in the forest. Thomas ran toward the sound, heart pounding. In a small clearing stood the wagon, the horses still hitched but grazing calmly on the underbrush. Of William and Samuel there was no sign. "They can't have gotten far on foot," Sheriff Davis reasoned. "We'll widen the search at first light," but Thomas knew with a father's intuition and the terrible knowledge of what dwelled in the Ríos homestead that they wouldn't find his sons in these woods. As the search party made their way back toward town, Thomas looked back one last time at the distant silhouette of the house on the hill. A light burned in an upstairs window, A window he knew had been dark and empty when they searched the house hours earlier. 5 years passed. The Ríos homestead stood empty, its fields returning to wilderness, its structures slowly deteriorating under sun and rain. No one in town spoke of the Mercer family anymore. It was considered bad luck. Thomas and Eleanor had never left. After the disappearance of their sons, Eleanor had retreated into a private world of grief from which she rarely emerged. They had taken rooms above the general store in town, neither willing to abandon hope that their children might someday be found. Thomas had aged 20 years and 5. His once robust frame had thinned, his dark hair now streaked with gray. Every spare moment was spent searching the mountains and forests surrounding the old property, following rumors and whispers of children seen playing at the edge of the woods. On the 5th anniversary of that terrible night, Thomas sat alone in their small rooms, Eleanor having finally fallen into restless sleep. A knock at the door roused him from his dark thoughts. Sheriff Davis stood in the hallway, his face grave. "Thomas, you need to come with me. Have they found something?" Hope flared briefly, as it always did. "Someone's moved into the old Ríos place," the sheriff said. "A family with young children." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "We have to stop them. That's why I'm here. They won't listen to me, think it's just local superstition. But if they heard from someone who... double quotes, he trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. Within the hour, Thomas was riding beside the sheriff toward the property he had sworn never to approach again. As they crested the final hill, the house came into view below them. Lamps burned in the windows. A wagon stood in the yard. Children's voices carried on the evening breeze. Thomas urged his horse forward, desperate to reach the family before nightfall. But as they approached, he pulled up short, staring in disbelief. A boy of about 17 stood on the porch, watching their approach. Beside him was a younger boy, perhaps 11. Even in the fading light, Thomas recognized them immediately. "William?" he whispered. "Samuel?" The older boy smiled, a familiar smile that had haunted Thomas's dreams for 5 years. But there was something wrong about it, something that didn't reach his eyes. "Hello, Papa," William called, his voice unchanged despite the years that should have passed. "You came back to us." Thomas dismounted slowly, his legs threatening to give way beneath him. Sheriff Davis grabbed his arm in warning. "Thomas, something's not right here." But Thomas couldn't stop himself from moving forward, drawn by the sight of his lost children standing before him, unchanged by time. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice breaking. "We've searched everywhere. We've been here, Papa," Samuel replied, his childish voice exactly as Thomas remembered. "Waiting for you and Mama to come home." As Thomas reached the bottom step, the door behind the boys opened. A woman emerged. A loner, as she had looked 5 years ago, before grief had hollowed her cheeks and dimmed her eyes. "Thomas," she said, smiling warmly, "we've been waiting so long. Won't you come inside? Margaret's made tea." Thomas froze, reality crashing over him like ice water. "You're not my wife," he said hoarsely. "My wife is in town." The thing wearing Eleanor's face tilted its head curiously. "Are you sure, Thomas? You sure it's not just what you wanted to believe, that you all escaped that night?" Memories flooded back, running through the forest, Eleanor's hand in his. Had they really made it to town? Or had that been the dream, the desperate fabrication of a mind unable to accept the truth? Sheriff Davis was backing away, reaching for his pistol. "Thomas, get away from there now." But Thomas couldn't move as the door opened wider, revealing Margaret standing in the hallway, a tea service in her hands. Behind her stood Maria Ríos and 3 children with hollow eyes and 2 wide smiles. "The house has room for everyone," Margaret said. "We saved a place for you, Papa." Thomas felt the world tilting beneath him. Had he ever left? Or had the entity simply allowed him to believe he had escaped, toying with him all these years? Sheriff Davis's hand closed on his shoulder, pulling him backward. "That's not your family, Thomas. Whatever's in that house, it's not them." As if in response, the faces of his children began to change, smiles widening beyond human capability, eyes darkening to bottomless pits. The house itself seemed to shift and breathe behind them. "Last chance, Papa," William said, his voice now blending with others, older and hungrier. "Come home to us." Thomas backed away, tears streaming down his face. "My children are gone." The figures on the porch watched silently as Thomas and the sheriff mounted their horses. As they rode away, Thomas heard children's laughter echoing across the fields, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The Ríos homestead burned to the ground that night, the flames visible for miles around. Sheriff Davis led the men who set the fire, making sure nothing remained but ashes. But the land remembers. And some say that if you walk those hills at twilight, you can still hear children playing in the walls of a house that no longer exists, scratching from within.